So it's a pleasure to introduce today's second speaker, Professor Günther from University of Ulm. Günther is director of the Department of Neural Information Processing in Ulm since, I don't know, 16 years or longer at least. And he's by training a mathematician, but soon after he became habilitated in mathematics, he entered the Max Planck Institute for Biological Cybernetics, where he developed brain models with Valentino Weitenberg. And at that time, there were also people like Tommaso Poggio and Mar at the Institute every now and then. So it was a really exciting environment to discuss early brain theories about heavy cell assemblies and otherwise. And well, these ideas were partly compiled in a book that he wrote, Heavy Cell Assemblies, an Alternative Approach to Artificial Intelligence. And that book, or these ideas, also then drove his research during the last 40 years. And he's going to speak about models of the brain, how we can model brain function. So most of his thinking is rooted in the classic ideas of heavy cell assemblies, which some of us here in Plymouth are also interested in. So please, Günther, let us know what you think, and thanks for coming.
Thanks for the invitation. I hope I speak loud enough. Yeah, okay. So I don't have a very big schedule. I mean, so it is. You can also interrupt me at any time. I just wanted to tell you some very simple ideas about.
Can you use the microphone?
Is it? But I can speak louder. Okay. But I always fall back into, you know, this. The thing is, I have learned this just in a book which I was reading called Thinking Fast and Slow. I learned that it is hard if you need some of your attention to speak louder than you normally speak and think at the same time. And that's what you experience. So,
the microphone.
Does it work?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you don't have to divide your attention.
So now I have again a divided attention, but not so bad. Okay. So I have not such a big schedule, and also I don't want to tell you the newest things that we did in our institute, but I want to do some very basic things. And I think even maybe you don't need it, because I have learned from the schedule of this week that at least you or some of you have already started modeling neural networks in some ways, right? And so, but still I'm asking the questions, why and how do we do brain modeling? And I'm asking these very elementary questions because I think they are related. So what I want, so I mean, kind of the take-home message is that how you model the brain depends on why you model the brain. And I want to go into this. Well, you know what the brain is. This is this mass of neurons, so which we think are the processing element, which process something. There are, I don't know, billions, about 10 to the 10 or 10 to the 11, depending on who counts, of them in our skull, in our head. And this is the brain, and people superficially subdivided into these different lobes. Maybe you heard about this also. It just says where they are, in the front or on the side or at the back, and they say it in Latin to make it a bit more complicated. And also sometimes they say something about what is supposed to be done there. For example, this part is called motor cortex, and the other is somatosensory cortex, so there is function somehow related to these parts. Or even on the superficial level, here you have auditory cortex, which has to do with hearing, and here in the back you have the visual cortex, which it doesn't say. This, I think, comes from a language-oriented book, So we have here Wernicke's and Broca's areas which have to do with language processing, as you might know. And then you know there are these neurons in the brain, and you know about that the neurons have these, the synapses are connecting the neurons, and you have the dendrites and the axons, where the information is gathered and the dendrites is transmitted to the other neurons by the axons. And you know all this, right? By the end of this week. Right? Okay. So, how do you model this and why? So you can say this mass of neurons is a physical system, and so it can be modeled like all physical systems by equations, differential equations normally you use to model physical systems. What you model is actually the process, the physical process of activation of neurons in the brain which develops there. And why do you do this? Well, one used to do, when you think, for example, about weather forecasting, you model the physical system of the weather, of the winds and the rain and so on, and you do this in order to make weather predictions. But nobody really models the brain to make predictions about, right? If you model the brain, I model your brain, and then I can make predictions of what you are going to do. This is not likely to be successful because it happens faster in your brain than I can model it. Opposite to the weather. If you want, of course, if you want to model the weather in every detail, it may also, I mean, there are so many molecules involved, maybe even more molecules than we have neurons in the brain. If you really model this in every detail, it may also take very long. So in order to make a prediction, in order anyway to model anything, you have to make some kind of simplification. And the simplification depends on the level at which you want to model. So this is one thing. So really you have to choose some kind of modeling level to say, okay, I want to leave out certain details and I want to focus on other things. Normally also what you do, you don't model the whole brain, but you model only pieces of it. Let's say I only want to model the visual cortex, which is this part, which is maybe 1/4 or so. Reasonable part of it, but it is not the whole brain. Or you say I want to model the visual system, everything which has to do with vision. Something like this. But of course you can ask yourself, as was also mentioned, I mean, one of the points of the previous talk, that actually you cannot really model the visual system, or you cannot understand the visual system as its own. You can only understand it in interaction with motion and moving your limbs and things like that, and your eyes, of course. So you cannot really decouple the visual system from the rest very well. So, but the other way to do it, if you really want to model biological systems, is to go to smaller animals. You can do it with flies, or with even smaller animals, like worms. The worm, there's this well-known worm, where you know all the neurons and how they are connected. They are, I think, less than 1,000, I think 642 or something like this. And they know how they're connected, so they can model it, and then they know how the worm works. Of course, not completely, because the body of the worm is also missing, so you have to model it also somehow. And then after a lot of research and with a lot of computing power, we can predict how the worm twitches. Which is a success, of course. It is a success. And so this is...
And then from there, human vision, right? That's the next step.
Then human vision, and then what we were discussing, qualia. So that's one.
The worm is qualia already.
The worm must have, yeah, because otherwise it wouldn't twitch, right? Okay. What did I want to say?
What and why?
So what and why? Yeah, I'm still in the why. So if we model it just as a physical system, where we have differential equations, we have what physicists call state space. So when we know all in classical physics, if you, from all the particles, you know where they are and which direction they move, then you can predict for all time how the system is going to go on.
Yep, this is basically Laplace's demon where you...
Exactly, this is
But this
Laplace's
has been
demon.
revised since quantum physics.
No, not really.
Heisenberg's uncertainty
No,
principle.
not really.
Not really?
No.
I'm quite sure actually about that.
Okay.
It's because this is Newtonian physics and
We can talk about it.
Okay, but this is Newtonian physics. And
This is Newtonian physics.
And Newtonian physics, everybody agrees it's outdated, isn't it?
Yes.
Okay, so you
But
agree
it's still what people do when they model something. So when
Okay.
you model a system with differential equations, you are acting Newtonian physics. And maybe it doesn't hold for some of the molecules. And the same in the brain, I think. So you say, well, the activation of all the neurons in the brain maybe are sufficient to have a state from which you can predict what is going on in the future. So why do you do this? You don't do this because to do prediction, but you do it maybe because you want to, you can compare what you get with experiments. So you model the outcomes of neuroscience experiments, and then you can get a relation to the people who do neuroscience.
Make it a little louder.
It's directional modeling.
Okay.
11.
Is that better?
Yeah.
So this is what some people call dynamical models, or when people say the brain is a dynamical system, they mean that they model it as a dynamical system. What people are more interested in normally when they model brains is the functions of the brains. And this is a tool made for functional modeling, and this is a completely different thing. It also has nothing to do with the choice of the levels, it's just a completely different story. You want to model what is actually what you think, where we have learned that what this brain does is performing what we have the experience, what we do in our minds. So it is actually, we believe that there is a relation between the brain and the mind somehow. And so we are interested in certain interesting functionalities of the mind, which we do when we do cognitive science. And then we think, well, maybe we can model brain processes in such a way that they can be related to functionalities of the mind. And there are, again, several reasons why you should want to do it. One reason is if you have a theory of how the brain achieves certain things that the mind does, like, for example, understanding what I say, maybe not what I say, but understanding normal language, and or producing sentences in English, or solving mathematics problems or something like this, or playing chess, something like this, or interacting in a normal conversation with people, then you want to see how you can base this. You have a theory how this could be based on processes happening in the brain, then you should make a model of this, and then what you do is then you relate some of the activities of the neurons to mental things, to mental items, and then you say, okay, this neuron is active, this means now my system has understood Apple, or whatever. Yeah? And then this is an interpretation that you give, and with this interpretation you can use this model of the brain to model something about the mind. This is what many people do. And so, but I think this is a very important distinction, which I want to draw, so that you remember it. There is this relation between the process that we observe and the function that it fulfills, and then underlying this both is the structure. So the connectivity, for example. And normally, when you model physically, you relate structure to process, and when you model functionally, you relate this also to some functionality. I have used this computer here only to give you some illustrations of this very simple ideas. So let's move through this. Well, this is just another. So you know this picture, of course, where you have this topographic representation of your limbs and things in the motor cortex and also in the sensory motor cortex. I couldn't decide which one to use. When you think about functionalities, you think of these very old pictures, these phrenological pictures, where people put things which they think are done somewhere, which are important in the mind, like secretiveness, cautiousness, sublimity, which I read here, where you can read as hope, time, and they put it into the brain in some places. So you can say, okay, if this, so what it means is if you destroy this area, then for this person, causality is gone. Maybe, whatever it means, right? Or hope is gone. That's of course very bad if hope is gone. But of course, if half your brain is destroyed, then hope is gone anyway. Maybe. And so this was of course very naive, and we have now more modern pictures of this. I showed you one before, so which is not directly talking in terms of mind terminology, but I mean finally we want to get there somehow. Yeah, I also couldn't decide which one to use here. And then there are more modern things which the psychologists put into our brains. So now they don't relate it to brain areas nowadays, but they put it into boxes, and then you can assume that somewhere maybe in the brain there are these boxes, but you shouldn't ask to, I mean, if you try to pin it down, where exactly is the episodic buffer or the phonological loop, then you can study literature for fMRI and other things maybe for 10 or 20 years, and then, well, you don't know. It's not so clear where it really is. Maybe it is somehow a network of different areas. It is maybe distributed somewhere. So it is also not so easy to relate this directly to the brain.
And at the same time, the paper you took the picture from is one of the 10 most cited.
Yes, yeah, that's why I found it so easily. Yeah, also it is not so clear what these different types of memory, whether they are really in different places, or maybe the same synapse has a short-term storage part and also a long-term storage part, and so this probably could be in the same place, actually, this crystallized part and the other part, who knows?
Actually, there are papers which are titled the neural correlates of Bentley's working memory models, so people exactly try to do that, but it's difficult.
But the question is what to get out of these papers.
And Bentley actually says that the central executive is like a rag bag where people throw everything in they don't understand, so it's a very fuzzy concept.
Yeah, but yeah, and people mostly think that this central executive is probably somewhere here in the front.
But the frontal cortex is big.
It's again similar. You can put everything in the frontal cortex if you don't know where else to put it. This is also, I think, related to this. So this is something. This is a dynamical system. So we have simulated this. This is a simulation of a few thousand neurons, meant to simulate a very small piece of the visual cortex plus another area which we call a higher area. We didn't say which one it is. Maybe V4 or something. What you see is gray values, yeah, and you see red dots. This is a spiking neuron model, so the neurons have two variables. One variable is the potential for making a spike, so to say. It could also be understood as a potential in terms of electricity. So it's the voltage on the membrane, something like this. And light means higher potential, and dark means lower potential. So that all the neurons in the background, which are more or less dark, have practically low activation, and the ones which are lighter have higher activation, and if the activation crosses a certain threshold, then this neuron makes a spike, and we see a red dot on the picture. So this is just a physical simulation of a part of the visual cortex, we think, so it's only less than a square millimeter, and of course simplified. The neuron model is simplified, doesn't contain all the details that we might know about these neurons. And also it is only, it's not maybe 10 million neurons or so which are there, but it's only 10,000 or so it's simplified. But well, the idea was that it should show something, but it is not so important what we want to show. Maybe you can tell us what you see. What do you see on this picture?
An ellipse, an inverted triangle, and a square.
Yeah.
And that was the stimulus?
Yeah. That was the stimulus. So it is a superposition of these things, and the goal of the paper was to show that if you look at the coincidence of the spikes, you can see that there is more coincidence happening in one figure and less between different figures. So you can sort of bind together the different pieces which are superimposed here by coincidence of the spikes. That was one of the purposes of this simulation, to show that this is possible, and it works by the interaction with the higher area, which has a stored memory representation of these three things. And so the binding goes through interaction between the higher and the lower area. That was the idea. But the question is, if I show it again, maybe I can show it again. How do I show it again? The question is, why do you say that? I mean, this is not there. Of course, there is no. Also, if I wouldn't have shown the continuous variable with this dark and light and only the spikes, you might not have noticed that there are these three figures. And also, I mean, this part of the brain doesn't know that there is a triangle, of course. So there is, neurons are activated and they happen to be in a triangular shape. So when we say that this is a triangle, an ellipse and a square, we are already going beyond the physical level of the modeling. We are already attaching meaning to this activation of neurons. So we are crossing from the purely process modeling already to some kind of functional modeling, assuming that it makes sense to talk about triangles and squares. Right? So we have already crossed the levels without really doing it explicitly in this kind of modeling. So this happens all the time, right? When people model something. So, yeah, I want to talk a little bit about the levels. But if you want to model the whole brain, you need to model. You need to model the interaction of many areas of the cortex, for example, and maybe also some subcortical structures. And then, of course, you have to do more simplifications. So, well, maybe you can also get away with not so many simplifications, and you can have more complicated models of larger structures. I mean, now, this is a picture just showing the cortex again with the long-range cortical-cortical connections between different areas, which are, so there are two connection systems, a short-range system in the neighborhood of each neuron. You have connections inside each of the areas, and then you have long-range connections between different areas, far away. Yes?
Yeah, nowadays we have chaptography, so we can
yes.
basically, what's the technology used to trace? To tracing of neural.
Yes, yes. This is a very early example of this. This was done with very old-fashioned methods in 51.
Tensor imaging, exactly.
Yes, you can do that on living brains for people, but you're not always quite sure whether you really get all these things right. This was done in monkeys with very old-fashioned methods. Would not be allowed today. At least not with monkeys, maybe with people, but not with monkeys. So, but it is the same. I mean, I think this is even more solid knowledge maybe than what you get from fMRI nowadays. But you get more. I mean, you have tons of results And some of them are valid and some of them are less valid maybe. But that's another question I could talk about. Also would take too long maybe. So, so I wanted to say you can do this modeling in a more detailed way, but so nowadays you can even choose to model much of the brain, maybe not all, but you can model billions of neurons maybe with more detail. And I think the problem of doing this, I mean there are large projects who are interested in this, and I think the problem, the restrictive, the bottleneck, so to say, is not really the computer power nowadays. We can model lots of things with computers better than we did in the last century. We were more restricted maybe by computing power, now we are not so much. But the bottleneck is more or less the details. So the knowledge. I mean, if you want to model this in detail, you have to know all the details, and you have to know which neurons are connected to which. And if you have a complicated model of a neuron which has 50 parameters for the neuron, then you have to know those 50 parameters for every neuron. And this would mean maybe 100 years of neuroscience, which has to be done before you can specify a larger model. I think this is the bottleneck and not the computing power. Yeah. But you can do it nowadays. But of course, if you don't want to wait until all these details are really known, you can make a more simplified model to make just a specific point. And if you are interested in interesting functions, then you have to do this nowadays. So you have simplified models which use the interaction between different areas of the brain in order to show certain interesting functionalities. And the types of functionalities that people are interested in can be anything, can be many different things. Like I have here a small list which I wrote in the train, which is, for example, walking. Yeah? How do you organize walking? Following an object with your eyes, we saw this this morning. Recognizing faces, multiplying numbers. We can multiply numbers with our brain somehow, at least with our mind, but maybe also with our brain. Writing papers, solving problems, chess playing, painting, poetry, dreaming, having emotions, understanding language, understanding images. And these are all things which we do with our minds, and we may have theories of this box-like type about how different processes in the mind may do it, and if we want to translate this into brain, we have to think about how to do it, and it would be interesting to do it. And it would also be interesting in some places for using it. So this is another motivation. You can say, I want to model with brain-like machinery, I want to model these interesting functionalities or cognitive abilities in order to put them into robots or into computers so that it is easier to act with computers. We are also engaged in one such project in Ulm University. If you want, I can talk about it later. But this is one of these projects where you want to understand people and interact with them. So everybody does this nowadays. And you can think that if you use brain machinery or neurons, that maybe you can have more efficient parallelizable ways of doing this so that it can be done by your machinery in real time, if you buy enough of it. So that's also a motivation for doing this. And you know, the question about the qualia in the last talk, I think the answer is, my answer would be, well, if the robot really should be able to interact seamlessly with people in a conversation or so, this is proof that it has to have qualia, because otherwise it couldn't do it. So, and we don't have to ask where does it have it. I mean, it is made of maybe. If it's not made of flesh but only of steel or something, it still can have qualia, I think. If it can make a conversation, but it is still a long way to get it there. I mean, we are not, the roboticists and also the other modeling people are not quite there yet. Yeah, I can just show you some more of these very simple models. So one way we modeled these things was using a simplified architecture of these short and long range connections. This paper goes back to my former boss, Valentin Breitenberg in Tübingen. And what we made out of it was a model with different cortex areas. Each of these areas is a feedback system of neurons. The connections are formed by associative memory. If you don't know what associative memory is, you have a set of neurons, two sets, and then they are like here, and then they are connected, cross-connected by, when they are co-activated, you make a synapse between them. This is called heavy learning, and this is the basis of simple associative. And when you make the connections in this way, inside the areas you make connections of the population of neurons with themselves, with the same population, which is called auto-association, and between the areas you connect one area, a bundle of fibers coming from one area to the neurons in the other area, like here, and this is called hetero-association. And by doing this, you can connect all this together. We have written a program how to generate such systems, and then we can let it run, and then it can understand language, actually. If you interpret, of course, the activity in these areas as what they are programmed into it to be, like this should be the representation of an applicant. You can say, okay, this is now activated, so it means this area is recognized an applicant. Something like this. So when you model at this level, actually the modeling is not so much different from if you model very simple neurons, because instead of a neuron, you now just have a population, which had called an assembly of neurons. So we just move from one neuron to a group of neurons, so there may be a few hundred neurons, maybe several thousand neurons. But the idea of the model is actually very simple. If the assembly gets enough input, it gets activated. If it doesn't get enough input, it doesn't get activated. So it's very simple to a single one neuron thing. So if I show you simulations with single neurons, it could also be interpreted as a simulation on the assembly level. There are of course differences, because in the assemblies you can have overlap between the groups, which you cannot have with single neuron representations, because either they are the same or they are different, but there cannot be an overlap. So that's an important concept, I think, because by using the overlap you can model similarity in these groups of neurons, so you can do much more with the groups than with the single neurons. But otherwise, the basic ideas are very simple. So the idea is here, each of these pieces of the cortex is modeled by two associative memories, one hetero and one, or several. One auto for itself, and then hetero for the connections from the incoming areas. And as you said, there are papers showing how many areas a typical cortical areas gets input from, gives output to on these long-range systems. There are these, one of my former co-workers died very young. It was better did not to assemble these data. And there's a nice database, I think it's called CogNovo, about these things, where you can see about the long connections. That's for the market. Huh? That's for the market. So I just show you some very simple things. So what we did a course for the computer scientists, showing that with these neural networks you can actually do everything that you can do with computers. So you could also say more formally that they are Turing universe. I just show the ingredients. You can stay active. So what you do is here you have just something, a neuron or a group connecting to itself, and if it gets an input, these are the time steps here. Now the input is coming, it gets activated, and then it stays active. Yeah. And you can store things by making, by heavy learning, so you make connections from one to the next. And so you can, if you have stored a sequence, you have learned connections from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4, so these can be sequence of neurons, or it could be sequence of actions, which are represented by the neurons, or it can be sequences of groups of neurons. But what happens is, here you have learned a sequence, and now you activate the first of the sequence, and then the activation runs through, and this means you have retrieved the sequence. And you can do recognition of a sequence. You have the same sequence, and now you have inputs here, and you want to recognize that the inputs are actually corresponding exactly to this sequence. So if these inputs are coming in the sequence, then if the threshold is 2 in these neurons, so it needs 2 inputs coinciding, then of course this gets activated. And then if the sequence comes from above in the right way, then it goes through, and then this output says, okay, the sequence has been recognized. If it would have come in any other order, then this would not be activated. So the same very simple learning mechanism can generate sequences and can also recognize sequences. You can also have branching of these things. So if you have here, it starts here, and then it has to decide where does it go, but if it gets an input from here, then it goes this way, right? And if it gets an input in the right moment from the other side, then it goes this way, so you can do branching. You can also do if, then else, and things like that you need. So you can do here, you get an activation, and if A happens at the right moment, and B happens at the right moment, then it goes this way, and it doesn't go the other way. And if it doesn't, then it goes the other way. Yeah? That's why you can do this. You can also have loops, so you have a loop structure, and it goes around happily, does instructions in the loop, and now something comes from here, and it activates this neuron which inhibits this one, and so it cannot go on. So the loop is stopped. Yeah? So you can do a loop of instructions until some condition is fulfilled. Any questions? So we can do computer science. I mean,
where's the output from that loop?
Well, somewhere. No, this is a loop of instructions. So, I mean, so you can assume that each of these has branching to other things.
Okay, yeah.
Which are not shown, to make the picture so complicated.
Yeah.
Talking about branching, is there also something like pruning? Because neuroplasticity is basically based on the notion that we have redundant connections which are pruned due to experience.
So there is something like pruning. I don't know very many people who model pruning actually. There is pruning, of course, used in artificial neural networks, but with no direct relation, as far as I know, to the neural processes of pruning. I don't know how the well, of course, I think the neuroscience people would say pruning is done by similar mechanisms as the associative learning, so this activation of the neurons strengthens the synapses, and inactivation weakens the synapses. And eventually, if they are too weak, either the whole neurons die or some of the synapses die. And this is pruning. I think that's what the neuroscience people say. Maybe there are also models about. Do you know models about pruning? Yeah?
Well, there is growing neural gas.
Sorry?
Growing neural gas.
Yeah.
It's like a self-organizing map which builds nodes, and when they're not used, they get discarded. So this would be equivalent.
This is also, there are many similar things where you prune like this. So what is it called? Brain damage, I don't know, controlled brain damage or something like this. I forgot the name. So there are many, but this is, I would call artificial neural networks. So it is not, people don't claim any relation to real neurons. But there are also, I think there are also must be simulations which are more neuroscience related about pruning. I don't know. So coming back to this box model, we can also work to simplify the ideas of the computing with these boxes. So we assume that there is some kind of global inhibition inside each of the boxes. So we have in the local area of the brain, we have not only an excitation, we have also inhibitory interneurons which inhibit the neurons around them. And if you use this surrounding global, sort of global is of course in quotes because doesn't mean that it has to be all over the brain, but only in some local area, but it is local, it is global in this local area. So it is unspecific, maybe it's better to say it is unspecific. So we have here an area, and here something is going on happily in this area, and if we inhibit this area just globally from outside, by this symbol there, then of course, then it goes down. So this can simplify the machinery in this. Or you can have what people call synfire chains. You have associations from one group of neurons to the next, which moves through, as I showed before. You can do this, you can have a triggering of this, which means it doesn't go just in one pass through, but you can control the timing. So when it stays, and only when it gets a trigger signal, it goes to the next step in the chain. And then when it gets a trigger signal again, it goes to the next step. This is much, you need it, I mean, if you want to do computations or functional things, it is often very useful to have not a synfire chain which just moves through without being able to control it. So we have the problem of the timing, which you may have noticed in the diagrams before. This branching signal has to come exactly in the right moment of time, and if you want to not to control the timing so fine, in such a fine-tuned manner, then it is better to have triggered synfire. So it just stays, and when the trigger signal comes, then it goes to the next. So this is one way of realizing this with global inhibition. So we activate this, and you see this here, this group of neurons or neuron activates this one here and inhibits this one here. And we have on this, so we have two areas, and this area here is inhibited, can be inhibited globally. So what happens is now this is activated and it stays active, or it activates this, and this now cannot activate this one here because it is inhibited by this one. So nothing happens, it stays like this until I give it a trigger signal which inhibits this part, and this gets inhibited, and then this gets activated, and we have moved one step ahead. And then it stays again until we give it a trigger signal, now, the red arrow, and then it goes one further. Right? Okay. And then it goes off. You can also do the same triggering not by inhibition, but by activation. Thomas and I wrote a paper about this 2 years, no, maybe more, 4 years. Well, so it's again the same thing, it goes here. Nothing happens until you activate, give some additional activations to all the neurons in this area. There are mechanisms for this known in neuroscience, I think. And now it goes one step further, and by the global inhibition inside the area, it deactivates the last one, and now it is one step ahead, and then when you activate it, it moves further. So these are not just PowerPoint slides, but they have been generated by a very simple single neuron, one neuron per block computer simulation program. So there is actually a simulation where I will show you that it works. So how much time do I have? 10 minutes? 10 minutes, okay. So I talk, maybe if you want, I can talk a little bit more about the associative memories, because I worked with them for a long time. But I can also stop here, and you can have more questions. I can go quickly through this, and then stop. I can go on talking about language and so on, but so we have, as I mentioned, we have these. This is the baby model, these areas. This is hetero and auto association. We actually, in some areas, we also have a hetero association inside the area, so that this area can learn sequences, like I showed before, so you can have these triggered sequences also in these areas. And we use associative memory. So the associative memory idea is very old, of course, goes back to Steinbuch, actually, in Germany, who called it die Lernmatrix, the learning matrix. And later, David Wilshire was, I think, the first one who showed how you can store a lot of information with this kind of binary associative memory. And later, the physicists like Hopfield invented less efficient versions of it, and are famous for it. But I think the most efficient way is really this thing which goes back to Steinbuch and Wilshire, and I also analyzed it 10 years later. Yeah, it is this structure model which I also use as a logo. So it is, you have here, these lines would be the dendrites, these lines would be the axons, the synapses are on the crossing points. And so what happens is if we activate, so it is empty in the beginning, so there are no connections. Well, this is of course all not really biological, but there are biological analogies. So what just schematically, you activate some neurons, which you see above. These ones are now activated. And then due to the feedback, the activation comes round. And then you form a small assembly. So a group of neurons are now connected. And then you do it again with another group of neurons. And now you have in this matrix, we have these green connections and the red connections. Of course, the connections don't know their color. So when you now activate this with two neurons here, then you see this pattern here, 0, 1, 1, 0, 0, 0, is more similar to the green pattern than to the red pattern. So the overlap between this input and the green pattern is larger, and therefore it should activate the green pattern. And this is what it does, because when you calculate the sum activity in these rows, you see there is 2 and there's only 1 in these parts here. And so if you put a threshold at 2 or below 2 slightly, then you get the green pattern out again. And this works with hundreds and thousands of patterns, and there is a large literature about the efficiency of this funny storage method. Yeah, no, I'm getting also. So that was it. This was only just showing how the basic idea of the associative connection works. You can do the same thing also with the hetero-associative connections, but it is slightly more complicated with the feedback versions. That's why I showed this feedback version. Okay, I think with this I can finish this talk, and I hope you have some questions. Thank you.
Thanks for the nice overview. When I said 10 minutes, I said you could finish in 10 minutes the presentation, but there's still a little time afterwards. So we have now time for plenty of questions, and there is one.
When you showed the activation in V1 for the triangle, the ellipse, and the square, as you mentioned, you get a pattern of activation in V1 that looks like the stimulus that's falling just by virtue of the fact that you have the retinotopic mapping.
Exactly.
Now the question is, I know you don't believe this, but the naive question is, okay, so who's looking at that to see the ellipse, the triangle, the square? Yeah.
That's why we did these more extended simulations with these many areas, where we can show by just making the associations to higher areas, and then also to motor output areas, we can actually produce a system which can understand the command system and, for example, put the orange to the apple. And then the system has a camera, it looks around for the orange, takes the orange, looks around for the apple, and puts the orange to the apple. when you give, so it understands the sentence, it understands the image, simple image in front of it, and does what is asked.
So
this is done by these systems that I showed, which it needs several areas to do all this. So about 20 areas, which are connected in this very simple associative memory fashion, but it can do it. And then I think this answers the question, because I don't ask the question where in this machinery is the place where the system knows that it has an apple. I could ask this question, and I also could point to one of the areas, but I mean the point is really that the system does what it should do, and it is maybe not so useful to ask where does it know what it should do. I mean, this is of course a very nasty thing. Maybe one should talk more about it, but let's see first what other questions.
Okay.
More questions? Jack?
Yeah, so you sort of sketched your diagram here, sort of 3 different levels of modeling.
No, but they are not different levels. They are different aspects.
It's quite similar to David Marr's tri-level hypothesis.
No, it's not. Well, because David Marr has it is a little bit related. It is a little bit related. So David Marr says something like, when you want to model a certain functionality, you first have to find out what the problem is, then you have to formalize the problem.
So that's the function.
That would be the function. Then you have to devise an algorithm.
Process.
No. That is still the function. And then you have to implement the algorithm in neural hardware. That would be the structure. And then when you let it run, that is the process. So I don't think that people do it like this.
No.
So what happens is actually, and also David knew this, of course, but he wrote it this way because this is the typical artificial intelligence way to put it, right? So you start from the problem and from inventing the algorithm down to the implementation. Of course, this is happening when we want to solve a problem with a neural network. Yes, we think about the problem, we think how could the neural network do it, but already when we think about how could the neural network solve this problem, we are not just thinking of an algorithm, but we are thinking of already about an implementation of the algorithm. So it is not so easy in our thinking, I think, how we solve these problems to separate these levels. To say, okay, we can completely separate the algorithmic level. But what we actually do when we invent is we think of the neural hardware that we have and we think, what can we do with it? And then we come up with something which we can later also formulate as an algorithm. Okay?
Yes, well, my question was going to be, so where your sort of cell-assembly idea, where do they appear? Is it in the function side or is it in the structure side? It seems somewhere in between. It's not exactly neurons, it's still trying to describe it.
Yeah, but the cell-assembly ideas comes from Hebb.
Okay.
Hebb is a cognitive psychologist. And I think for him it was, he wanted to create a language which is somehow on a level between the mind speaking, the psychological speaking of the mind, and the physical speaking about the brain. And so I think his idea was to put something in between, which makes it a bit easier to connect. And I think he was a little bit mistaken there, because yes, it makes it easier, but it is somehow, but I don't think that's what I wanted to say, that the distinction between functional thinking and process thinking is not really one of levels. So I think it helps actually, because the units of the assemblies are somewhat larger than the units of the neurons, and I also use it, of course. It makes it easier to make this transition, but still you have to make this transition. And he always does it in his book, so he always interprets the activation of assemblies in psychological terms. And and that is, of course, much more reasonable and much more easy to understand than to do it in terms of neurons. Okay, but it is still a big step. And when you are not aware of this step, then you get into these discussions about the qualia and all this. Right? And I'm trying to avoid this. Okay.
Ivana?
So this means neural programming language with for loops and conditionals. I think it's nice, it's systematic, but is it true? Like, is there something you can pinpoint in the brain and say this is exactly how it happens, or you expect it to be shown?
I don't. Of course, it may be that there are such things in the brain. I mean, among all these neurons, there might be such small things also in the brain somewhere. Yeah. So, in this sense, it is true. You know? Or you could also say, on a higher level, if you interpret these things not as single neurons but as assemblies, you can say, okay, yes, if we train a monkey to, I don't know, to have a delayed response to some task, yeah? To press a button and then wait for a while, and then, depending on the stimulus, press another button or not, or something like this, then he has inside his machinery, maybe by association and also by controlling his learned association, for example, by global excitation or inhibition in certain areas, he has to make a machinery which does such things, which does something like if then else on this assembly level. And it may be that when he learns this, that he forms such little diagrams, or maybe. I don't know. But of course, when I made this for the computer scientists, I was getting at it from a different perspective. I was now asking myself, but if we want to build something, like in a computer, if we need, I mean, we had what he asked before, so we have an idea how to build an algorithm with neurons. And everything works nicely, and then suddenly we have this problem, we need an if then else. And then we say, okay, now we have to give up. Now we have to go use rule-based methods from artificial intelligence. We cannot do this with neurons anymore. And this is not true. We can still do this with neurons. Maybe it is a bit more artificial than the other things, but it is doable. Okay?
Ian?
Yeah, it's really an extension of that question. Is this, people looked at the connectivity between the neurons and looked at the sort of basic building block motifs. Do you end up with that kind of thing?
I don't know.
Oh, but do we have the tools? Sorry, are we able to observe neurons at that level to see whether these patterns could?
Well, I don't think that we have the tools. It is not easy, right? Because, I mean, many of the things have to be identified on a single neuron level. And for example, so you cannot do this with fMRI, right? Because you don't have the resolution to see what's happening. And so you have, technically it is very demanding. You need, but maybe with optical recording and with now with these new methods of what is it called, optical programming, or what is it called, optogenetics. Yeah, maybe you can find ways of getting at such problems, but it is not easy.
But on the other hand, you use very few principles. Yeah, so auto-association.
The processing.
These are very simple.
These principles are there. I mean,
and physiologists believe them.
Yeah, they believe them. Yeah, of course, there has been a slight debate about the auto-association recently. So we had to write an article about this, which was rejected 2 times before it was finally accepted. Yeah, because the people most people think that the synapses which are important for the associations are actually these NMDA synapses, and they are an implementation of what is called STDP, time depending plasticity, or whatever it's called. And if you think about this, it depends on the timing, and you think that it has, in order to work, the pre-signal has to come before the post-signal so that the synapse is formed, and this seems to be against auto-association, because then it is between this more or less coincidentally activated neurons and themselves, but not themselves, but the same group. And we were able to show, yes, it is completely compatible to learn these things, to learn auto-associations also with STDP if you consider the jittering of the spikes in the population, and it is in the right amount, which is actually physiological, I think. So even with these more defined models of synaptic plasticity, you can do what we did in these older simulations.
So it's a very computer science kind of question. So you I think you clearly explained why it's very useful and interesting to show that it's very that neurons are computer equivalent. Because obviously you run into complexity issues, which will take might take an enormous amount of time or enormous number of neurons to do something this simple to do with just a processor. And so near the end, you talked about much more complex structures instead of the very basic ones, which probably did a lot of to prove turing equivalence. And is there theoretical work which attempts to use the more complex, show how the more complex structures allow for solving the? Is this like an approach in neuroscience? Use the more complex structures and show how they can be used to kind of optimize what you could do with a simple building blocks.
One thing is, we worked on this efficiency of these associative memories. And so we were able to show that you can, in a population of n neurons, you can store more and also separate more than n. When you use this distributed representation, you can store more than n patterns. And you can retrieve them efficiently very quickly. So this is something which is, if you compare it with addressing or storage and addressing in normal computers, it is actually more efficient than many of these hashing methods and so on. So this is comparable, and it is even, if you look at it in the right way, it is even slightly superior. But it is only one aspect, of course. It is not talking about complicated processing.
So it's not systematic. You can show that some things are better, but that's not systematic approach.
I don't know how it can be systematic. Complexity analysis is always, I think, based on one particular problem. And so one particular computational problem, and then you can analyze the complexity and you can compare the complexity of different algorithms. And so first you have to decide what the problem is. And then you can start asking this more computer science. So, I don't know, maybe for example, computer scientists know a lot about the complexity of sorting. So you learn this in the first semester. And I don't know, I don't have a good method for sorting this. So maybe sorting is not one of our best cognitive abilities. I mean, also you could say this is why we invented computers, right? We are also not so good at multiplying numbers. So we had these computers, that's why they have their name, for these purposes, which we are not so good at. So they are kind of complementary. But nowadays we are using computers also for writing papers and everything. Even conversations sometimes.
Final question, short?
Yeah, I also like the geometric aspect of this modeling, and the loop has this circle and so on. It's quite poetic, and I really like it. But do you really think, I mean, what we know about the brain is that astonishingly able to deal with damage. So if you really take it literally and say this is a chain of neurons that is connected and it's running around, and I would destroy one of those neurons, then this computation or this thing would break. So it's pretty brittle in a sense. And we know that the brain works different.
But if these things are not interpreted as single neurons but as part of neurons, then of course it is already much easier to do it. But for example, if you would damage one of these areas, which I use in my model, then the model wouldn't work anymore. And it seems somehow we can cope with damaging even of whole areas. And this is, I don't know. This is future work, let's say.
Okay, we have to go on, so let's